Skeleton is a bony framework which support and protect the soft tissues of the body. It is comprised of bones and associated ligaments, tendons, and cartilages. On the basis of position, we can divide the skeleton into three categories. Axial skeleton. It is formed by the long axis of the body and include the bones of the skull, hide bone, and vertebral column. The appendicular skeleton is formed by the bones of the forelimb and the hind limb and the girdles, which include the shoulder bone and the hip bones, and attaches them to the axial skeleton. Third type of skeleton is a visceral skeleton, which is present in the visceral organs. In this video, we will discuss about the appendicular skeleton only. And the appendicular skeleton, as we have discussed, it is comprised of thoracic limb and hind limb. Bones of thoracic limb. It is divided into four regions. The bones of shoulder girdle include scapula, coracoid, and clavicle. Bones of arm is formed by humerus. Bones of forearm include radius and ulna. Bones of manus include carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. In ox and horse, only scapula is present. Coracoid is reduced to coracoid process of scapula, and clavicle is absent. In dog, the clavicle is present in addition to scapula. In birds and lower mammals, the shoulder girdle is fully developed. Scapula is a flat bone which is attached to the anterior part of thoracic wall with the help of muscles, and this type of joint is called synsarcosis type of joint. Scapula has two surfaces, three borders, and three angles. Lateral surface is divided into two unequal parts by scapular spine. Above the spine is the supraspinous fossa, and below the spine is the infraspinous fossa. The spine terminates below into the projection called the acromion process. From this process, the acromion part of deltoideus muscle rises. Medial surface bears a shallow depression in the middle called the subscapular fossa, which occupies the subscapularis muscle. Upper part of the medial surface has a rough area for attachment of the serratus ventralis muscle. Anterior border has a prominent projection called the tuber scapulae. Posterior border has a nutrient foramen for blood supply. The vertebral border gives attachment to the scapular cartilages. There are three angles in scapula: anterior angle, posterior angle, and glenoid angle. Scapula of horse, the first difference is acromion process is absent. Infraspinous fossa is double than the supraspinous fossa. Little above the middle of spine is a prominence called the tuber spine. The coracoid process is much longer. Tuber scapulae is larger and away from glenoid cavity. Scapula of dog. The infraspinous and supraspinous fossa are equal in size. Coracoid process is absent. Acromion process is short and blunt. Tuber scapulae is blunt. Anterior and dorsal surfaces are continuous. In scapula of pig, the scapular spine curves backward over the infraspinous fossa. Acromion process is absent. In the scapula of fowl, the forelimb is modified to form a wing. Scapula lies parallel to the vertebral column. Clavicles are two in number, the right and left, which unite to form the wishbone. Humerus forms the shoulder joint above with the scapula and elbow joint below with the radius and ulna. It has four surfaces. Lateral surface is smooth, spirally curved, and forms the musculospiral groove, which contains the brachialis muscle and radial nerve. The medial surface is nearly straight. Just above the middle of this surface is a teres tuberosity, to which the tendon of latissimus dorsi and teres major muscle attaches. Anterior surface wider from upper side and narrow below. It is separated from the lateral surface by a distinct border called the crest of humerus, which bears a prominence called the deltoid tuberosity for the insertion of the deltoideus muscle. Posterior surface has the nutrient foramina in the distal third of the surface. The humerus has two extremities, the proximal extremity and the distal extremity. The proximal extremity has three parts: the head, neck, and tuberosities. Neck is constricted part which connect the head with the shaft. Head is circular, convex articular surface to articulate with the glenoid cavity of scapula, forming the shoulder joint. There are two tuberosities, the lateral and medial, separated by a groove called a bicipital groove for the passage of tendon of biceps brachii muscle. The lateral tuberosity is larger. Distal extremity consists of two condyles of unequal size which are separated by a ridge. These condyles articulate with the radius and ulna. The medial condyle is large and is called trochlea. Lateral condyle is small and is called capitulum. Behind and above the condyles are epicondyles. Humerus of horse. Deltoid tuberosity is more prominent. Bicipital groove is divided by a ridge. Musculospiral groove is more deep and twisted. Summit does not overhangs the bicipital groove. Lateral tuberosity is not much larger. Humerus of dog. The radial and the olecranon fossa communicate by a large supratrochlear foramen. Deltoid tuberosity is in form of ridge. Bone is longer and less twisted. The musculospiral groove is not prominent. Humerus of pig. The bicipital groove is undivided. Plate of bone between olecranon and the radial or the coronoid fossa is thin and is sometimes perforated, forming a supratrochlear foramen. Proximal and distal extremities are inclined. In the humerus of fowl, the medially below the head pneumatic foramen is present. The bone is less twisted and head is oval in shape. Bones of forearm include radius and ulna. Radius is a long bone. It has a shaft and two extremities. Shaft has two surfaces and two borders. The anterior surface is also called dorsal surface. It is smooth and slightly convex in length. Posterior surface is also called volar surface, is concave in its length. Medial border is slightly concave at its proximal end. Lateral border is more strongly curved and has no special feature. Proximal extremity has the articular area which is divided by a sagittal groove into two divisions. The medial articular area is longer and articulate with the medial condyle of humerus. Lateral articular area is small and articulate with the lateral condyle of humerus. On the medial side, there is a bicipital or radial tuberosity for the attachment of the tendon of biceps brachii muscle. On the anterior side, there is a lip-like projection called the coronoid process, which is received into the coronoid fossa of humerus during the extreme extension or the flexion of the elbow joint. Posteriorly, there are two articular areas for articulation with the ulna bone, and between these are two interosseous spaces, the proximal and distal interosseous space. Distal extremity present three articular areas, medial, middle and lateral, to articulate with the radial, intermediate and ulnar carpal bones. On the medial side, there is a prominent projection called styloid process of radius. Anteriorly, there are three shallow grooves called the extensor groove for the attachment of the extensor muscles. Radius of horse. The radial tuberosity is more prominent. Ulna is shorter and reaches up to the middle of radius. Only proximal interosseous space is present. Extensor groove are better developed. Distal articular area are not oblique. Radius of dog. The radius and ulna are not fused with each other. There is a single interosseous space extending throughout the length of the radius. In the radius of pig, the radius is shorter and narrower than the ulna. The interosseous space is narrow. In case of fowl, the radius is smaller than ulna. Interosseous space is wide. Next bone of the forearm is the ulna, and ulna is a aborted long bone as the bone marrow is present only on the proximal side. It has two extremities and three surfaces. The anterior surface is rough except at two places. Medial surface is wide. Lateral surface present the radio-ulnar groove between it and radius. Proximal extremity is made up of semilunar notch and olecranon process. Olecranon process is quadrilateral in shape. Semilunar notch is placed below the anconeus process and articulate with the condyle of the humerus. Below the notch, there are two articular facets for the proximal extremity of the radius. Distal extremity fused with the radius and forms the styloid process of ulna, which forms the part of the facet for the ulnar carpal bone. Ulna of horse. The ulna is poorly developed and extend up to the proximal third of the radius. Only one interosseous space is present. Styloid process is absent. Semilunar notch more triangular. In the ulna of dog, the radius and ulna are not fused. It runs entire length of the radius and crossing from the medial to the lateral side on the posterior surface. In the ulna of pig, the ulna is massive and body is curved backward. Proximal extremity is large and distal extremity is small. In the ulna of fowl, the ulna is thicker and longer than radius. Interosseous space is wide. Bones of manus include carpals, metacarpals and discs. Carpals, normally there are 8 carpal bones, out of which 4 are present in the proximal row, 4 in the distal row. In pig, all the 8 carpals are present. Carpals of ox. In case of ox, there are 6 carpal bones. The proximal row is oblique and articulate with the distal extremity of the radius. It consists of the radial, intermediate, ulnar and accessory carpal bones from medial to the lateral side. The distal row has 2 bones, the second and third fused carpal bone, it is also called the os magnum, and the fourth carpal bone. The first bone of the distal row is absent. All the carpal bones have 6 surfaces: the anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, proximal and distal. The radial carpal bone, the first carpal bone, it is also called scaphoid, is present medially in the proximal row. It is convex and broad anteriorly and concave and narrow posteriorly. And the characteristic feature in case of ox is it bears a pointed projection posteriorly. Intermediate carpal bone is semilunar in the shape. It again has 6 surfaces. Anterior and posterior are non-articular. Medial surface has 3 facets for radial carpal and the lateral surface has 3 facets for the ulnar carpal bone. Proximal surface articulate with the distal extremity of radius and the distal surface articulate with the os magnum and the fourth carpal bone. Third carpal is the ulnar carpal. It is also called the cuneiform. The anterior and lateral surfaces are non-articular. Posterior surface has the facet for accessory carpal bone. Accessory carpal bone, it is also called the pisiform. It does not bear any weight and may be regarded as the sesamoid bone. In the distal row, the first carpal is absent. Medially, second and third fused carpal is present and laterally the fourth carpal bone is present. Second plus third fused carpal bone is also called the os magnum and it has posterior, anterior and medial surfaces which are non-articular. The lateral one articulate with the fourth carpal bone. The proximal surface has articular area which is separated by a ridge into the two unequal halves, out of which the medial one is larger and lateral one is smaller. The fourth carpal bone is also called the unciform carpal bone. It is lateralmost carpal of the distal row. Anterior, posterior and lateral surfaces are non-articular. Proximal surface has an articular area which is separated into the two unequal halves by a ridge. Carpal of the horse. In the horse, there are 7 carpal bones. The proximal row has the 4 carpals as in case of the ox, and the distal row has second, third and fourth carpal. Occasionally, the first carpal may be present in some animal as a small nodule. The first carpal of the proximal row is a radial carpal bone. It does not have the projection posteriorly on the proximal surface as we have seen in case of the ox. The intermediate carpal has triangular proximal surface which is broader anteriorly and narrow posteriorly. Ulnar carpal bone has triangular upper area which is narrow and pointed anteriorly and broad posteriorly. Accessory carpal is larger than ox. The medial surface is concave and lateral surface is convex. In the distal row, from medial to lateral side, second, third and fourth carpal bones are present. Second and fourth are of small size, but third carpal bone is biggest and easy to identify. Second carpal, it is the carpal of the distal row. The anterior, medial and posterior surfaces are non-articular. Proximal surface articulate with the radius. Distal surface articulate with the large metacarpal and the second metacarpal. In the third carpal bone, the anterior and posterior surfaces are non-articular. Medial surface articulate with the second carpal and lateral with the fourth carpal bone. The proximal surface has 2 articular areas, out of which lateral one is larger. In case of the dog, there are 7 carpal bones. The proximal row has 3 carpals, radial, ulnar and accessory carpals. The distal row has the first, second, third and the fourth carpal bones. In case of the pig, there are 8 carpal bones, 4 in proximal row and 4 in the distal row. In case of the fowl, in the proximal row, radial and ulnar carpal bones are present. The bones of the distal row are fused with the metacarpal to form the carpo-metacarpus. Metacarpal of the ox. Third and fourth metacarpal unite together to form the large metacarpal bone, whereas the fifth forms the small metacarpal bone. Large metacarpal bone is a long bone formed by the fusion of third and fourth metacarpal bones. The fusion is marked by a groove and a double medullary cavity inside. Now, the metacarpal bone has the 2 extremities, the proximal and distal extremity, and a shaft. Shaft has 2 surfaces and 2 borders. Anterior surface is also called the dorsal surface, is convex and bears a central groove called the dorsal median groove. On either extremity of the groove, there are 2 foramina. The palmar surface it is also called the volar surface, is flat and has a similar groove and foramen. Lateral border has the facet on the uppermost part for the articulation with the small metacarpal bone. The medial border is rounded. Proximal extremity wears two articular area and it is separated by the ridge anteriorly and notch posteriorly. Distal extremity has two condyles separated by a cleft. Condyles are divided into axial and abaxial part by the ridges. Small metacarpal of the ox is a very small bone situated at the posterior lateral aspect of the large metacarpal bone. Metacarpal of horse. Second and fourth metacarpal represents the small metacarpal bone, whereas the third represents the large metacarpal bone, and it is also called the cannon bone. The metacarpal is devoid of any groove on either side. Near the proximal extremity, there are two small facets for the small metacarpals on the posterior medial and posterior lateral surfaces. The proximal extremity has two articular areas divided by a ridge. The medial articular area is larger. The distal extremity bears a single condyle and is separated by ridge into the two parts. The medial condyle is little larger than the lateral. Small metacarpal bones, in case of the horses, are called the splint bones, has broader proximal extremity and tapering distal extremity. Metacarpal of the dog. There are 5 metacarpal bones. The first one is shortest, third and fourth are longest, and fifth is thickest. These 5 metacarpals articulate dorsally with each other by a lateral facet and form the diarthrodial joint. Each metacarpal has a shaft and 2 extremities. Each metacarpal carries 2 sesamoid bones behind, except first metacarpal having only 1 sesamoid bone. Therefore, total 9 proximal sesamoid bones are present in dog. Metacarpal of pig. There are 4 metacarpal bones. First metacarpal is absent. Third and fourth metacarpals are well developed. Second and fifth metacarpals are small and are placed caudally and do not wear weight. Metacarpal of fowl. There are 3 metacarpal bones, that is first, second and third. The first one is present as small projection on the medial aspect. Second and third are well developed and are fused at extremities. Metacarpals are fused with the distal row of the carpals and is known as the carpometacarpus. Digits. In journal, the 5 digits are present. In case of the ox, the first digit is absent, third and fourth are functional, second and fifth are non-functional and are present on the posterior aspect of limb as due class. Each functional digit has 3 phalanges, 2 proximal sesamoid bones and 1 distal sesamoid bone. The first phalanx is a long bone. It is largest among 3. It consists of 4 surfaces, 2 extremities. The posterior surface bears a nodular elevation about the middle on the either side for the ligament attachment. Proximal extremity bears an articular area which is divided into 2, that is the axial and the abaxial part by a sagittal groove. The abaxial is slightly higher than the axial one. The distal extremity is divided by a groove into the 2 condyles, of which the abaxial is larger. Second phalanx is a long bone with the medullary cavity. It has 3 surfaces, axial, abaxial and volar, or we can say it as a palmar surface. The proximal extremity has 2 facets, axial and abaxial, out of which abaxial is larger. Distal extremity is condyloid and is divided into 2 parts, axial and abaxial, by a groove, and the abaxial one is larger. Third phalanx is terminal bone and is enclosed within the hoof. It has 4 surfaces. Phalanges of horse. Only third digit is functional. First phalanx is longer than the phalanx of the ox. It consists of shaft and two extremities. On the palmar surface, there is a triangular V-shaped rough area for attachment of distal sesamoidian ligament. On the proximal extremity, there is a sagittal groove separating two articular areas. The medial articular area is larger. On the dorsal surface, there is rough area for attachment of the extensor tendon. Second phalanx of horse is a short bone because it do not have the medullary cavity. Third phalanx is entirely enclosed in the hoof. It has three surfaces. Articular surface faces upward and backward and articulate with the distal extremity of the second phalanx, but there is a narrow flattened area on the volar aspect to articulate with the distal sesamoid bone. The proximal border bears a central eminence called the extensor process. Volar surface is arced and divided into two unequal parts by the semilunar crest. There are two proximal sesamoid bones and the one distal sesamoid bone. The distal sesamoid bone is also called the navicular bone and is situated behind the junction of second and third phalanx. Phalanges of dog. The first digit has only two phalanges, first and third, hence it do not come in contact with the ground while walking. Rest of the digit have three phalanges each. First phalanx of all digit is four-sided and slightly bent forward. Second is 2/3 of the length of the first phalanx. Third resembles to the claw. There are 9 volar sesamoid bones in case of the dog. Phalanges of pig. Each digit has 3 phalanges. Phalanges of third and fourth digit are well developed, whereas that of second and fifth are small. There are 2 proximal and 1 distal sesamoid bone in each digit. Phalanges of fowl. There are 3 digits in fowl. First and second digit has 2 phalanges, whereas third has only 1 phalanx. Sesamoids are not present in fowl. Bones of hind limb consist of different regions: bones of the pelvic girdle, bones of thigh, bones of leg and crush, and bones of pes or the hind paw. Bones of the pelvic girdle or the hip bone include ilium, ischium, and pubis. The os coxae or the hip bone of the ox is largest bone among the flat bones of the body. It consists of 3 bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubis. These bones join to form acetabulum, which is a cotyloid cavity and lodges the head of the femur bone. Ilium is largest among 3 bones. It has 2 surfaces, 3 borders, and 3 angles. The dorsolateral surface is also called the gluteal surface, is concave cranially and narrow and convex caudally. The gluteal line extends on the medial border to tubercoxae and continue with the ischiatic spine. Sacropelvic or the ventromedial surface has 2 parts, the medial and lateral. Medial part is triangular and roughened for ligaments, whereas the articular surface has the irregular facet for the sacrum. Iliopectilean lines or the arcuate line is ventral to articular surface and it joins to the cranial border of the pubis. Psoas tubercle is ventral to iliopectilean lines and is for the insertion of the psoas minor muscles. There are 3 borders, the anterior, medial, and lateral. Cranial or the anterior border is also called the crest. It is thick and rough and concave. The medial border is deeply concave. Lateral border is concave and rough. There are 3 angles, the medial, lateral, and the acetabular angle. The medial is known as tuber sacral and forms the highest point of the skeleton. The lateral is known as a tuber coxae and has pair of tuberosity at either ends. Acetabular angles join with the ischium and the pubis at acetabulum. Ischium of ox. It forms the floor of the bony pelvis. It has two surfaces, four borders, and four angles and a body. The pubis of ox is smallest among the three bones. It forms the cranial part of the pelvic floor. It has two surfaces and four borders. Acetabulum is a cotyloid cavity formed by the union of ilium, ischium, and pubis. It lodges the head of the femur and forms the hip joint. It has articular and the non-articular part. Obturator foramen is largest foramen of the body and is elliptical in the shape. It is present between the pubis and the ischium. The measurement of the pelvis is called the pelvimetry, and the pelvis has two diameters, the conjugate and the transverse diameter. Conjugate diameter is the length between the body of the sacrum and the cranial end of the pelvic symphysis at pelvic inlet. Transverse diameter is distance between the two sos tubercles. We can differentiate between the male and the female os coxae on the basis of following points. First one is both the diameters are more in females. The inclination of the pelvis is more in female. Pelvic outlet and the ischial arch are larger in the female as compared to males. The ischia of both sides join at wider angle to make the cavity more roomy in case of the female as compared to the males. Os coxae of horse. Gluteal line is not so prominent. Sos tubercle is more prominent. Tuber sacral are more nearer to each other. Tuber coxae are smaller and more oblique. Ventral surface does not have tubercle. The ventral ridge at symphysis is absent. The tuber ischii is bifid. Os coxae of dog. The ilia are parallel to the median plane. Greater ischiatic notch is elongated and shallow. Lesser ischiatic notch is absent. Pelvic symphysis is thick. Acetabular fossa is deep. Os coxae of pig. Tuber sacral is lower than crest. Sos tubercles are prominent. Ischial tuberosity is trifid as in case of the ox. The rim of acetabulum is thick. Os coxae of fowl. The ischium is angular in outline and much smaller than ilium. Acetabulum is perforated. Pubis is slender plate of the bone. The obturator foramen is formed by pubis and ischium and is located ventral to the acetabulum. Femur bone is also called the thigh bone. It is largest bone of the body. It articulates with the acetabulum proximally to form the hip joint and patella and tibia distally to form the stifle joint. It has the shaft and two extremities. Shaft has four surfaces and two borders. Lateral, medial and anterior surfaces are smooth and continuous. The posterior surface is not smooth. Medial border has lesser trochanter situated at the upper part of medial border towards the posterior surface in form of a small tuberosity. Proximal extremity consists of head, neck, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter, trochanteric fossa and trochanteric ridge. Head bears a small depression in the middle called the fovea capitis. Greater trochanter is little proximal to head. Lesser trochanter is small tuberosity present on the upper part of the medial border, which give attachment to the iliopsoas muscles. Trochanteric ridge connect the greater and the lesser trochanters. Trochanteric fossa is depression between ridge and head. Distal extremity. It consists of condyles and trochlea. Trochlea is situated anteriorly and present two ridges, that is medial and lateral, which articulate with the posterior surface of the patella. Medial ridge is larger. Condyles are medial and lateral, situated at the posterior aspect of the bone. Intercondyloid fossa is deep and accommodates spine of the tibia and cruciate ligament of stifle joint. Epicondyles are two in number. Femur of horse. The bone is more massive. Trochanter tertius or the third trochanter is present on the lateral border for the attachment of tendon of superficial gluteus muscle. Lesser trochanter is in form of ridge. Fovea capitis is deep. Trochanteric ridge is directed along the length of the bone. Trochlear tubercle is present on the medial ridge of the trochlea. Femur of dog. Trochanter tertius is absent. Lesser trochanter is tuberculous. Greater trochanter is at lower level to the head. The trochanteric ridge are of equal sizes and shape. Femur of pig. Third trochanter is absent. Head is more curved. Greater trochanter does not extend above the head. Trochanteric ridges are of equal size. Femur of fowl. Head is comparatively small and rough. Only greater trochanter is present. Trochlear ridges are wide apart. Bone is bent along the length. Tibia is a long bone, articulate proximally with the femur to form stifle joint and distally with the tarsals to form the hock joint. It has 3 surfaces, 3 borders and 2 extremities. The medial surface is wide above and narrow below. Lateral surface is faintly concave and gradually spiral down to the front. Posterior surface is flattened and divided into 2 parts by rough popliteal lines which runs obliquely. Triangular area above the lines is occupied by the popliteus muscle. Anterior border is prominent and termed as the tibial crest. Medial border is rounded and has the tubercle on the proximal part for the attachment of popliteus muscle. The lateral border is concave and forms the interosseous space with the medial surface of fibula bone. Proximal extremity has condyles, spine, intercondylar fossa, popliteal notch, tibial tuberosity and sulcus muscularis. Medial and lateral condyles has saddle-shaped surfaces for articulation with the corresponding condyles of the femur bone. Condyloid eminence is central prominence having medial and lateral parts. Medial is at higher level than the lateral one. There are 2 intercondylar fossae. The popliteal notch separates the tibial condyle at the posterior aspect. There are 2 intercondylar fossae before and behind the spine. Popliteal notch separates the tibial condyle at proximal aspect. Distal extremity consists of 2 grooves separated by a ridge. These grooves are sagittal and present an extensor synovial fossa. These grooves articulate with the tibial tarsal bone. Tibia of horse. Grooves on the tibial tuberosity is well marked. Both malleoli bones are fused at the distal end of the tibia. The grooves on the distal extremity are oblique. Tibia of dog. Shaft is convex medially at the upper part and laterally at the lower part. Tibial crest is very prominent. Upper part of the body is prismatic and lower part is cylindrical. Tibial tuberosity is not grooved. In the proximal part, there is facet for fibula at the caudolateral aspect of the lateral tuberosity. Tibia of pig resembles the tibia of ox. The tibial tuberosity is absent. Tibia of fowl, largest and longest bone of the body. Tibial crest is prominent. Distal end is condyloid. The bones of proximal row of the tarsus are fused with the distal end of the tibia to form the tibiotarsus. Fibula bone is a rudimentary bone in case of the ox. Patella of ox is triangular sesamoid bone which is placed in front of the trochlea of femur. It has 2 surfaces, 2 borders, 2 angles, base and apex. The anterior surface is rough, posterior surface is smooth, medial border is concave and lateral border is rounded. Medial angle is larger and the lateral one is blunt. The base faces upward and backward and convex. Apex is pointed and directed distally. Patella of horse It is not triangular as in case of the ox. The angles are not prominent. Apex is blunt. Medial and lateral borders meet to form the wider angle. Tarsal bones. Generally, there are 7 tarsal bones. These are present in 3 rows. The proximal row has tibial and fibular tarsal. Central row has a central tarsal. Distal row, it includes the first, second, third and fourth tarsal bones. In case of the ox, there are 5 tarsals: tibial, fibular, central plus fourth fused, first, second plus third fused. Tibial tarsal bone. Grooves on the trochlea are sagittal. Proximal surface articulate with the distal extremity of tibia. The distal trochlea has 2 condyles and articulate with the central plus fourth tarsal. The plantar surface has large oval facet for articulation with the fibular tarsal. Fibular tarsal. It is longer and more cylinder. Tuber calcis is marked posteriorly by shallow groove. Anterior surface articulate with the plantar surface of the tibial tarsal bone. Distal surface articulate with the lateral articular facet of central plus fourth tarsal. Central plus fourth tarsal bone. It extends across the entire breadth of the tarsus and articulate with all the other tarsal bones. First tarsal bone is quadrilateral and small nodule-like. Second and third tarsal. The proximal surface is concavo-convex and articulate with central tarsal. Distal surface articulate with the medial articular area on the proximal extremity of the large metatarsal bone. Lateral surface bears a small facet for fourth tarsal. In the horse, the 6 tarsal bones are present, that is tibial, fibular, central, first plus second fused, third and the fourth tarsal bones. The tibial tarsal bone is medial bone of the proximal row and has 6 surfaces. The proximal and the dorsal surfaces are continuous and form trochlea for articulation with the distal row of the tibia. Distal surface has 2 articular areas. The plantar surface is oblique and irregular with the 4 facets for articulation with the fibular tarsal bone. The medial surface is non-articular. Lateral surface is smaller than the medial and articulate with the fibular tarsal bone. The fibular tarsal bone is largest tarsal bone. It consists of body and the medial process called the sustentaculum talli. The proximal part of body is tuberous and forms the tuber calcis or the point of the hawk. Central tarsal. Quadrilateral in the shape, it is present between the tibial and the third tarsal bone. Fused first and second tarsal, it has 6 surfaces. Third tarsal bone. Fourth tarsal bone, it is lateral bone of the distal row and has 6 surfaces. The 7 tarsal are present in the dog. In pig there are also 7 tarsal bones are present: tibial, fibular, central, first, second, third and fourth. In case of the fowl, the proximal row is fused with the tibia to form the tibiotarsus. The distal row fused with the metatarsals to form the tarsometatarsus. Metatarsal of the ox. One large metatarsal bone and a small metatarsal bone is present. The large metatarsal bone is formed by third and fourth, and the small metatarsal bone is formed by the second. The large metatarsal bone is longer than the metacarpal and it has 4 sides. The proximal extremity present the medial and lateral articular areas. The medial is large and has the facet for articulation with the fused second plus third tarsal bone. Behind it, a small facet for first tarsal is also present. Lateral articular area is for central plus fourth fused tarsal bone. On the posterior medial aspect, small metatarsal bone is present. Distal extremity is similar to the metacarpal bone. Metatarsal of the horse. 3 metatarsal, out of which 1 is large and 2 are small. The large metatarsal bone has the shaft and two extremities. Shaft is more cylindrical at lateral surface. Proximally there is a groove directed obliquely downward and backward. It indicates the course of the great metatarsal artery. Proximal extremity is slightly concave and articulate with the distal row of the tarsals. Posteriorly, there are two facets for small metatarsal bones. Distal extremity is similar to that of the metatarsal bone. Metatarsal of dog. There are 5 bones. First is ill-developed and articulate with the first tarsal bone proximally. The rest are larger than metacarpals. Metatarsal of the pig. Pig has 4 metatarsal bone and the characteristic feature of the metatarsal of the pig is same as that of the ox. In case of the fowl, tarso-metatarsus, it is a single long bone, proximal and is irregular for fusion with the distal row of the tarsal bones. It presents facet for articulation with the tibiotarsus. Distal end present 3 trochlea for articulation with the second, third and fourth digit. In male, a bony spur arises from the medial aspect of the body of metatarsus. A very small bone located at the posterior aspect of the distal end of the metatarsus is the first metatarsal bone. The bones of the digits and sesamoids are same as was present in the forelimb.
To watch more educational videos on veterinary and animal sciences, subscribe the channel and please touch the bell icon. Guru Angad Dev Veterinary and Animal Sciences University, Ludhiana on YouTube.